Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G. The late 1970s, for many Americans, it was a decade that felt of immense decline. The ghosts of Vietnam still haunted the national psyche. The shame of Watergate had eroded faith in the government. The economy was crippled by stagflation, that unholy marriage of stagnant growth and soaring inflation, a term that entered the lexicon to describe an economic nightmare. And the energy crisis saw cars lined up for blocks, sometimes for hours, just to get gasoline, a stark symbol that America was now vulnerable. President Jimmy Carter, in a now famous speech, spoke of a crisis of confidence that was gripping the nation. It was against this backdrop of anxiety, disillusionment, and a palpable sense of drift that a powerful countercurrent, conservative, long building beneath the surface, surged into full view, something that we call the conservative revival. How did a nation that had for decades largely embraced the liberal consensus forged by FDR's New Deal and expanded by LBJ's Great Society find itself now turning so decisively to the right? What were the intellectual seeds, the social anxieties, and the political strategies that fueled this triumph of the right, as our textbook chapter aptly calls it? Today, we're going to explore these questions, hearing the voices of those who championed this change, those who resisted it, and those who were caught in its transformative wake. As Ronald Reagan, the man who would become the charismatic standard bearer of this movement, declared in his first inaugural address as president on January 20th, 1981, quote, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem," end quote. This single, powerful sentence encapsulates a fundamental shift in American political philosophy. It wasn't just a critique of current policies, it was a direct challenge to the very role of government that had been dominant for nearly half a century, since the very depths of the Great Depression. This declaration signaled a new era, but its origins, as we see, were far from new. They were deeply rooted in the American past. The conservative movement that swept Ronald Reagan into the White House in 1980 wasn't a sudden apparition conjured out of the anxieties of the 1970s alone. It was the culmination of decades of intellectual work, political organizing, and a growing, multifaceted reaction to the perceived excesses and failures of modern liberalism. To understand the new right, we have to listen for echoes from earlier American battles over power and identity, as well as the role of government. The story of the conservative revival is, in many ways, a story of old arguments finding new voice and words, as well as new urgency. Consider the legacies of Reconstruction. The period following the Civil War was a radical experiment in redefining American citizenship and the balance of power between federal governments and states. The amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments specifically, aimed to secure the rights of formerly enslaved African Americans, and as historian Eric Foner notes, the 14th Amendment in particular represented, quote, "a profound change in federal-state relations by empowering the federal government to protect citizens' rights against states' infringements." However, Reconstruction was met with fierce conservative resistance, often framed in the language of states' rights and as a defense against federal overreach. Opponents argued that federal intervention was an unconstitutional imposition, an attempt to create an unnatural social order. This rhetoric, which successfully dismantled Reconstruction and rolled back many of the federal protections for African Americans, didn't disappear. It became a durable and adaptable tool for conservative movements throughout the 20th century with varying levels of success. The same arguments used to resist federal efforts to ensure racial equality in the 1870s were echoed during the civil rights movements of the 1950s and the 1960s to oppose desegregation mandates. The new right, growing up in the 1970s and then forging in the 80s, then broadened this appeal to states' rights and limited federal government to encompass critiques of economic regulation, social welfare programs, and federal involvement in education, drawing on a long historical precedent of skepticism towards centralized federal power. We can also look to the Gilded Age of the 19th century. This era of unprecedented industrial growth and technological innovation, the rise of massive corporations, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and the Vanderbilts. The dominant economic philosophy was laissez-faire capitalism, a belief that the free market with minimal government interference would naturally produce the most efficient outcomes. The debates from this period over corporate power, the need for regulation from the government, wealth disparity, and the social responsibilities of capital never fully subsided, nor were they settled. The new right would later selectively echo the Gilded Age's calls for deregulation and free markets, arguing, much like their 19th century predecessors, that less government intervention unleashes economic prosperity. However, this revival of laissez-faire principles in the 1980s would also reignite concerns about income inequality, reminiscent of the Gilded Age's stark social divisions. The most direct ancestor of modern conservatism, however, was the overall reaction to FDR's New Deal in the 1930s. The Great Depression was a national trauma that led to a fundamental reshaping of the American government's role, and the New Deal created a social safety net, Social Security, unemployment insurance, federal aid programs, and dramatically expanded federal power to regulate the economy, far from laissez-faire principles. For many conservatives at the time, this was an alarming development. Republicans and wealthy business leaders criticized the New Deal for excessive government intervention, for the high costs, and even drew some parallels of FDR to Soviet communism. This opposition, rooted in the principles of limited government, individual liberty, and fiscal prudence, became a foundational element of the conservative movement that would gain strength in the post-war years. Finally, the post-World War II and Cold War eras provided another crucial ingredient: a fervent anti-communism. The global struggle against the Soviet Union justified a strong national defense, an assertive foreign policy, and a deep suspicion of ideologies perceived as collectivist or threatening American capitalism and traditional values. These themes would become central to the new right and the Reagan administration's worldview. The fear of external communist threats sometimes blended with anxieties about the internal social changes, creating a potent mix for conservative mobilization. The simmering discontent of these historical echoes needed intellectual articulation and political champions to coalesce into a movement, and this took decades. Several figures and institutions, however, were pivotal in finally becoming successful in breaking into the mainstream. William F. Buckley Jr. and his magazine, The National Review, which was founded in 1955, played an indispensable role. Buckley, an urbane and witty intellectual, aimed to make conservatism intellectually respectable. His mission statement for the National Review famously declared that it was, quote, stands athwart history, yelling stop at a time when no one is inclined to do so, end quote. Buckley brought together disparate strands of conservative thought: free market capitalism, libertarianism, social traditionalism, and crucially, a robust anti-communism. He also understood the importance of gatekeeping, working to exclude extremist elements like the John Birch Society and overt anti-Semites from the mainstream conservative movement, thereby enhancing its credibility and respectability. Then there was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. His 1960 book, The Conscience of a Conservative, became a sacred text for this burgeoning movement. It passionately advocated for individualism, the sanctity of private property, a staunch anti-communism, and warned against the dangers of continued centralized federal power. Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign ended in a landslide defeat to LBJ, but it was a critical organizing moment for many conservatives. His defiant acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention included lines that became a rallying cry for the next few decades. Quote, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." End quote. To many moderates, this sounded like radicalism, but to conservative activists, it was an electrifying call to arms, a rejection of compromise with what they saw as an encroaching liberalism of the 1960s. Goldwater's campaign effectively neutralized the more liberal wing of the Republican Party, and significantly, he won 5 states in the Deep South, a traditional Democratic stronghold up until that point. And this signaled the beginning cracks in the old political order, and it foreshadowed the Southern strategy that would later reshape American politics. Another key intellectual figure was Fred Meyer, a senior editor at the National Review. Meyer articulated the philosophy of fusionism, an attempt to unite the often competing impulses of traditional conservatives, who emphasize virtue and social order, with libertarians who prioritize individual freedom and free markets. Meyer's central argument, as outlined in several works, but specifically in The Defense of Freedom, was that, quote, virtue could reside only in the individual, and that the state should protect freedom, but otherwise leave virtue to individuals, end quote. This intellectual framework was crucial. It provided a common ground for economic libertarians, wary of government intervention in the marketplace, as well as social traditionalists concerned about secularism and the decline of moral absolutes, to unite against an expansive, secular liberal state, which they both saw as a threat. This fusion was a key component in forging the political viable coalition of the new right. And we cannot forget the grassroots energy, particularly from young people. The Young Americans for Freedom, the YAF, founded in 1960 at Buckley's Estate in Connecticut, adopted the Sharon Statement as its declaration of conservative principles. YAF activists were the foot soldiers of this early conservative movement, playing a vital role in Goldwater's campaign and in cultivating a new generation of conservative leaders who would come to prominence in the decades that followed. Now that we've backtracked a little bit to some of the conservative roots that are going to coalesce into the new right, we really have to understand the liberal zenith of the 1960s and the early cracks in order to understand how they all came together. The 1960s, the focus of our previous episode, witnessed liberalism reach its apex with LBJ's Great Society. Landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act dismantled legal segregation. Programs were instituted like Medicare and Medicaid aimed to provide health care for the elderly and the poor. The Elementary and Secondary School Act represented the first major federal investment in public education, and the war on poverty through initiatives like the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 sought to create pathways out of poverty. Yet, this very expansion of government power and social reform began to generate significant backlash. A new group of intellectuals known as neoconservatives emerged. Many, like Irving Kristol, were former liberals who had grown disillusioned with what they had perceived as the unintended negative consequences of Great Society programs, the excesses of the New Left, and the weakening of American resolve in the Cold War. Kristol argued that neoconservatives were not hostile to the idea of a welfare state in principle, but were deeply critical of the Great Society version of it, whose legislation and programs were overreaches of the federal government and often proved to be counterproductive. Simultaneously, the triumphs of the civil rights movement, while morally imperative and long overdue, provoked a white backlash, particularly among some white Southerners and working class whites in the North who felt their status and security were threatened. Richard Nixon and his campaign strategists skillfully exploited these anxieties. They used coded language like law and order, and they appealed to the silent majority. And this became Nixon's Southern strategy, aiming to woo white voters who were uneasy about rapid racial change and federal desegregation efforts, particularly busing. This began a long-term political realignment as the once solidly Democratic South started to shift toward the Republican Party. Adding to this volatile mix were the profound social and cultural revolutions of the 1960s. The rise of the counterculture, sexual revolution, challenges to the traditional family structures, widespread experimentation with drugs, and fervent anti-war protests were deeply unsettling to many more Americans. They viewed these changes as evidence of moral decay at the heart of America, a breakdown of the societal order, and a rejection of the cherished values. This created a fertile ground for political movement that promised to return to traditional values and a restoration of that order. The stage was being set for a dramatic shift. If the 1960s were a period of tumultuous upheaval and for many optimistic change, the 1970s often felt like a decade of decline, a period of national malaise, as President Carter would later term it. This pervasive sense of gloom further eroded faith in liberal solutions and meticulously paved the way for a conservative resurgence. The decade was punctuated by a series of crises that shook American confidence to the core, like we talked about last episode. The specter of the Vietnam War loomed large. This long divisive war finally ended in 1975, but not with the victory Americans had come to expect. It left a bitter legacy of over 58,000 American lives lost, deep societal divisions, a question of American military power and moral authority, as well as profound skepticism towards government pronouncements. Martin Luther King Jr., in his Beyond Vietnam speech delivered in 1967 at Riverside Church, had warned of the war's devastating impact not just abroad, but at home. King's words proved tragically prophetic. The immense cost of the Vietnam War, both in human lives and financial resources, diverted attention from funding the urgent domestic problems. This critique that excessive foreign entanglements drained resources from domestic national needs would later be echoed by conservatives arguing against what they termed as big spending liberalism, albeit often with different priorities in mind. Then came Watergate, the scandal which unfolded between 1972 and 74, culminating in President Nixon's resignation to avoid impeachment, shattered public trust in the presidency and government institutions. Revelations of widespread political espionage, the cover-ups, abuse of power at the highest levels fostered a deep cynicism among the American populace. This cynicism created a fertile opening for political candidates who promised to restore integrity, honesty, and crucially, to reduce the power of a federal government that many viewed as inherently untrustworthy and acting beyond the bounds of the law. Economically, the nation was adrift. The post-World War II economic miracle, which had fueled the affluent society, seemed to sputter and stall. Americans faced the bewildering and painful combination of high employment and runaway inflation. Stagflation. Prices of everyday goods soared while wages stagnated and jobs became scarcer. This economic malaise defied traditional economic solutions, which had largely guided policy since the New Deal, and many were led to question the efficacy of liberal economic management and solutions. Compounding these economic woes was the energy crisis, twice in one decade, in 1973 and again in 79. The oil embargoes led to skyrocketing fuel prices and, memorably, the long, frustrating lines at gas stations. These crises brought American dependence on foreign oil and its broader economic vulnerability home in a very tangible and unsettling way. It underscored a new sense of limits, a feeling that American abundance and autonomy were no longer guaranteed. Out of this pervasive gloom and disillusionment, the new right emerged not just as an intellectual current, but as a potent, organized political force. It was a coalition of previously distinct groups who found common cause in their opposition to contemporary liberalism and their desire for a different direction for the country. This coalition is often described as resting on three legs of a stool. The first being fiscal conservatism. These were individuals and groups, including many business leaders and a growing number of ordinary citizens, who advocated for lower taxes, reduced government spending, particularly on social programs, and widespread deregulation of the economy. They were frustrated by high taxes, persistent inflation, and what they saw as a burdensome government filled with regulations that stifled the economic growth and individual initiative. The second leg was social conservatives, often referred to as the religious right. This rapidly going and highly mobilized segment was deeply concerned by what they perceived as the moral decay of the nation. Key catalysts for their activism included the Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade decision legalizing abortion nationwide, the removal also of organized prayer from public school. There was rising divorce rates, the perceived decline of the traditional family, and the growing visibility and assertiveness of the gay rights movement. A pivotal figure in mobilizing this group was the Reverend Jerry Falwell, a Baptist minister and televangelist who founded the Moral Majority in 1979. Falwell articulated the frustrations of many religious conservatives when he said, quote, "A few years ago, we were told that religion and politics don't mix. We were told politics is dirty business. You fellows run your churches and we'll run the government, and they've done that right in the ground. In our country today, I never really believed that a Supreme Court of this country would legalize abortion on demand, which I totally agree with the Roman Catholic Church is murder." End quote. Falwell's call to action was a direct rejection of the notion that religion should remain confined to the private sphere. He and other religious leaders, the religious right, men like Pat Robertson, who founded the Christian Broadcasting Network and the later Christian Coalition, framed political engagement now as a moral imperative. Their goal was to restore traditional family values, as they put it, to fight against what they saw as societal evils like abortion and pornography, and to reassert Christian morality into public life. Added to this was another highly effective mobilizer of social conservatives, Phyllis Schlafly. Her organization, the Stop ERA, Stop Taking Our Privileges, she led a remarkable, successful grassroots campaign against the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, which had been on the verge of ratification in the early 1970s. Schlafly argued that the ERA, rather than liberating women, would actually strip them of existing protections and undermine traditional gender roles in the family structure. In her 1972 manifesto, "What's Wrong with Equal Rights for Women?" she famously asked, quote, "Why should we lower ourselves to equal rights when we already have the status of special privilege?" End quote. Schlafly's argument resonated powerfully with women who valued traditional homemaker roles and feared that the ERA would lead to undesirable social changes, such as women being drafted into combat, the erosion of alimony, and unisex bathrooms. Her campaign was a masterclass in grassroots organizing and effectively halted the ERA's momentum, still to this day not ratified, and it demonstrated the political power of mobilized social conservatives. The third leg of the new right was comprised of national security conservatives. This group, which included many neoconservatives, advocated for a strong military, an assertive, staunchly anti-Soviet foreign policy, and a rejection of the détente policies of the 1970s. They believed the United States needed to project strength on the global stage to counter the perceived threat of Soviet expansion. A clear indicator of the anti government sentiment during this period was the tax revolt. This movement gained national attention with the passage of California's Proposition 13 in 1978, a ballot initiative that drastically cut property taxes. It was a landmark victory for fiscal conservatives and inspired similar tax cutting efforts nationwide, signaling a widespread public desire for lower taxes and a smaller government footprint. Themes the new right would champion with great success. Crucially, the new right also began to attract a new group of voters, Reagan Democrats. These were traditionally Democratic voters, often white, working class union members, particularly from industrial regions in the North and the Midwest. They became increasingly disillusioned with the Democratic Party, which they perceived as having shifted its focus towards minority rights, to social liberalism, and a foreign policy they saw as insufficiently strong for the world today. These voters felt their economic concerns were being ignored as stagflation and deindustrialization soared, and social programs seemed to disproportionately benefit others to the detriment of them. Issues like rising crime rates, court-ordered busing for school integration, affirmative action policies fueled their anxieties and furthered their resentments. As Democratic pollster Stan Greenberg found in his influential study of these voters in Macomb County, Michigan, they, quote, no longer saw the Democratic Party as champions of their working class aspirations, but instead saw them as working primarily for the benefit of others, the very poor, feminists, the unemployed, African Americans, Latinos, and other groups, end quote. Ronald Reagan's message of economic optimism, traditional values, patriotism, and a strong America resonated deeply with this and other demographics just mentioned, leading to a significant crossover vote that would be instrumental in the sweeping Republican victories in the 1980s. This was not a mere political shift. This was a cultural and class-based realignment driven by a potent combination of economic insecurity and cultural anxieties. I know it took 27 minutes to get here, but we cannot understand the Reagan Revolution, this morning again in America, without understanding how conservatism worked. The optimistic slogan from Ronald Reagan's 1984 re-election campaign captured the essence of the era that he ushered in. His decisive victory in 1980 and even larger landslide in 84 heralded what many had called the Reagan Revolution, a period that sought to fundamentally reshape the American economy, its foreign policy, and the very role of government in the lives of its citizens. Now, Ronald Reagan was a former actor. He was also the former governor of California, and he possessed a unique ability to connect with the American people. His optimistic demeanor, his powerful communication skills earned him the moniker of the Great Communicator. He also had an unwavering belief in American exceptionalism, and these were key to his appeal. He promised to restore American strength, but maybe more importantly, to restore pride in the country and the prosperity that they perceived was adrift and decline in the 1970s. His 1980 campaign themes were very clear and direct: lower taxes, reduce government spending, with the notable exception of a massive military buildup for the Cold War, but also a revolutionized economy, a strong national defense to confront head-on the Soviet Union, and a return to traditional American values. He tapped into a deep well of frustration and a yearning for change that I spent the majority of this episode outlining. On January 20th, 1981, in his first inaugural address, he laid out the philosophical cornerstone of his presidency with that unforgettable line that I started with. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. This was more than just rhetoric. It was a clarion call of the Reagan Revolution. It signaled a dramatic departure from the post-New Deal consensus that had largely accepted and even embraced an active role for the federal government in addressing social and economic issues. At the heart of the Reagan domestic agenda was a bold and controversial economic philosophy popularly known as Reaganomics. An intellectual underpinning of Reaganomics was supply side economics, often associated with the Laffer curve. Economist Arthur Laffer famously argued, reportedly sketching his curve on a napkin for Ford administration officials Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld in 1974, that high tax rates actually discourage work, investment, and production, thereby reducing overall tax revenue. The theory posited that cutting tax rates, particularly for businesses and higher income earners, would incentivize them to invest more, create more jobs, and stimulate economic growth. This increased economic activity in turn would lead to overall higher tax revenues, even at lower rates, a concept critics often derided as trickle-down economics. The first major legislative victory for Reaganomics was the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, the ERTA. This landmark bill enacted a phased-in 25% cut in individual income tax rates over 3 years, with the top marginal rate of income falling significantly from 70% to 50%. The ERTA also provided substantial tax breaks for corporations, including accelerated depreciation for investments. This was followed by the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which further lowered the top individual income tax rate to 28% and simplified the tax code. Alongside these tax cuts, the Reagan administration aggressively pursued deregulation across a wide range of industries. Price controls on oil and gas were lifted. Restrictions on the financial services industries were reduced, notably with the Garn-St. Germain Depository Institutions Act of 1982, which further deregulated savings and loans associations. Enforcement of environmental regulations, such as the Clean Air Act, were relaxed, and public lands were opened up for more oil drilling and logging. The overarching goal was to reduce the perceived burden of government on businesses and to promote free market competition. A defining moment for the Reagan administration's stance on labor came early, in August of 1981, with the PATCO strike. When the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organizations, one of the few unions to endorse Reagan in 1980, they went on strike demanding for better pay and working conditions, Reagan's response was swift and uncompromising. Declaring the strike illegal because the controllers were federal employees, he gave them 48 hours to return to work. When most refused, he fired over 11,000 striking air controllers and permanently barred them from federal service, decertifying the union. While Reagan stated the strike was a matter of public safety and upholding the law, his actions were widely interpreted as a powerful sign of a new, tougher government stance against organized labor. As labor historian Joseph A. McCartan noted, this event, quote, inspired private sector employees to imitate his strike breaking, end quote, and it contributed significantly to a decline in strikes and overall union power in the subsequent decades that we feel to this day. The economic outcomes of Reaganomics remain one of the most hotly debated aspects of his presidency. Supporters point to the taming of inflation, which had plagued the economy of the 1970s, dropping from a high of 13.5% in 1980 to 4.1% by 1988. They also highlight a period of strong economic growth, particularly from 1983 onward, as well as substantial job creation, around 20 million new jobs during his tenure. The Cato Institute, for example, argues that, quote, real economic growth averaged 3.2% during the Reagan years, and that the real median family income grew by $4,000 during that period, end quote. However, critics, including organizations like the Economic Policy Institute, paint a different picture. They emphasize the dramatic explosion of the national debt, which nearly tripled in nominal terms, from approximately 997 billion when Reagan took office to around 2.85 trillion by the time he left. This was fueled by a combination of large tax cuts and significant increases in military spending without corresponding cuts in overall government spending. Critics also point to a sharp increase in income inequality, with the wealthiest Americans seeing substantial gains while wages for many workers and middle class families stagnated and even declined in real terms. Economist Paul Krugman, reflecting this view, wrote that, quote, while the rich got much richer, there was little sustained economic improvement for most Americans, end quote. The debate over whether the benefits of Reaganomics truly trickled down continues to this day. Just ask your parents. On the world stage, President Reagan sought to restore American strength and confront the Soviet Union head-on with renewed vigor. His foreign policy was characterized by a significant military buildup and a more assertive, often ideological posture. The guiding principle was what he called peace through strength, and Reagan authorized a massive increase in defense spending, arguing that a strong military was the essential thing to deter Soviet aggression and protect American interests globally. In a famous 1983 speech, he dramatically labeled the Soviet Union as an evil empire, signaling a sharp departure from the policy of détente that had characterized much of the relations of the 1970s, and it was a return to a more confrontational, earlier era Cold War rhetoric. One of the most ambitious and controversial elements of his foreign policy was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which was announced in March of 1983. Quickly dubbed Star Wars by the media, SDI proposed the development of a space-based missile defense system capable of intercepting and destroying incoming Soviet nuclear missiles, potentially using lasers and other advanced technologies. No wonder they called it Star Wars. Critics questioned its immense cost, its technological feasibility, and warned that it could destabilize the nuclear balance. It could escalate the arms race by violating the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Supporters, however, argued that SDI was a visionary attempt to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, and that it put immense pressure on the Soviet Union, contributing to its eventual economic strain and collapse. Central to Reagan's anti-communist strategy was the Reagan Doctrine, a policy of providing overt and covert aid to anti-communist resistance movements, often termed freedom fighters around the world, and it aimed at rolling back Soviet influence abroad. For example, in Afghanistan, the U.S. significantly increased support for the rebels fighting against the Soviet occupation that began in 1979. This support is often credited with bringing and helping to bog down Soviet forces, contributing to their eventual withdrawal. Afghanistan was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. There was also the example of Nicaragua, where the Reagan administration covertly supported the Contra rebels who were fighting to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government. This support was highly controversial and became the focal point of the Iran-Contra affair, but more on that later. There was also the case of Grenada. In October 1983, U.S. forces invaded the small Caribbean island of Grenada to oust a Marxist regime that had recently seized power, an action the Reagan administration justified as preventing the island from becoming a Soviet-Cuban base. The Reagan Doctrine, however, led to one of the biggest scandals of his presidency. I just mentioned it, the Iran-Contra affair. This complex and covert operation involved the secret sale of arms to Iran, at the time an avowed enemy of the United States and a designated state sponsor of terrorism, in the hopes that securing the release of American hostages being held in Lebanon by pro-Iranian groups. The proceeds from these arms sales were then illegally diverted to fund the Nicaraguan Contras, in direct violation of the Boland Amendment passed by Congress, which prohibited such aid. Key figures in orchestrating these activities included National Security Council staffer Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and National Security Advisors Robert McFarlane and John Poindexter. When the affair became public in late 1986, it triggered a major political crisis. In a televised address to the nation on March 4, 1987, President Reagan addressed the findings of the Tower Commission and took full responsibility for the actions of his administration, but also had maintained that some activities were undertaken without his direct knowledge. The Iran-Contra affair significantly damaged the Reagan administration's credibility. It's actually quite a shock that he even remained as president. And it raised serious constitutional questions about the executive power and accountability. And it led to several indictments and convictions, though some were later overturned or pardoned. Despite the scandal, the latter years of Reagan's presidency were marked by a dramatic thawing in U.S.-Soviet relations. And this had a lot to do with the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev as the reformist leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. And this created a new dynamic. Reagan, initially deeply skeptical of Soviet intentions, developed a working, friendly relationship with Gorbachev. Their 4 summit meetings and the landmark signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty in 1987, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, were a crucial step towards ending the Cold War. Historians continue to debate Reagan's precise role in winning the Cold War, though. Some credit his military buildup, his strong anti-communist rhetoric, and Star Wars SDI with placing unbearable pressure on a teetering, on the brink of economic collapse Soviet system. Others emphasize the internal economic and political weaknesses of the Soviet Union as the catalyst. The crucial reforms initiated by Gorbachev, like Glasnost and Perestroika, as well as the agency of popular movements in Eastern Europe that threw off Soviet domination. Many scholars conclude that it was a complex interplay of these factors. The end of the Cold War was less of a unilateral victory and more of a multifaceted process involving Reagan's evolving approach from confrontation to engagement, Gorbachev's bold internal reforms driven by systemic Soviet weaknesses, and the powerful desire for freedom among many of the peoples of Eastern Europe. The 1980s were not just about economic policy and superpower rivalries. Deep cultural fissures continued to divide the nation, often pitting socially conservative values against emerging liberal and secular trends. These conflicts became known then, as they are now, as the culture wars. One of the most devastating and politicized crises of the era was the AIDS epidemic. First identified in 1981, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, disproportionately affected gay men in its early years, leading to widespread fear, misinformation, and tragic stigma. The Reagan administration's response was widely criticized by activists and public health officials as slow, underfunded, and hampered by moral condemnation from some conservative quarters. As our textbook notes, quote, AIDS sufferers fought for recognition of the disease's magnitude, petitioned for research funds, and battled against popular stigma associated with the disease, end quote. Groups like ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, was formed in 1987, and it used confrontational direct action to demand government action, to demand research funding, and an end to the discrimination. The AIDS crisis had a profound societal impact, eventually leading to greater public awareness and medical advancement, but not before tens of thousands of lives were lost, and the gay community endured immense suffering and prejudice because of it. Another front of the culture war was popular music. In 1985, a prominent group of women, including Tipper Gore, the wife of then Senator Al Gore, and Susan Baker, wife of then Treasury Secretary James Baker, formed the Parents Music Resource Center. They expressed alarm over what they perceived as increasingly explicit themes of sex, violence, drug use, and occultism in popular music, particularly in rock and emerging genres like heavy metal and rap. Susan Baker testified before the Senate, quote, "There certainly are many causes for these ills in our society, But it is our contention that the pervasive messages aimed at children, which promote and glorify suicide and so on, have to be numbered among the contributing factors. End quote. The PMRC, as it came to be known, targeted artists like Prince, Madonna, Judas Priest, and Twisted Sister, and it led to highly publicized Senate hearings and ultimately to the music industry's voluntary adoption of the, and you've probably seen it, parental advisory, explicit lyrics, the labels they put on albums. This was a clear example of the culture wars playing out in the realm of artistic expression, in freedom of speech and parental concerns over youth culture. President Reagan sought to reshape the federal judiciary by appointing judges who adhered to the philosophy of conservative judicial restraint and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. His most notable Supreme Court appointments included Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981, the first woman to serve on the High Court, the elevation of William Rehnquist as Chief Justice in 1986, and the appointment of Antonin Scalia in 1986, who became a leading conservative intellectual voice on the court. The intensely publicized and ultimately failed Senate confirmation battle over Robert Bork's nomination in 1987 starkly highlighted the high stakes and the deep ideological divisions surrounding judicial appointments in this era. The 1980s also saw rising critiques of multiculturalism from some conservative circles. Concerns were voiced that an emphasis on diverse cultural identities was undermining national unity. It was eroding shared American values and leading to the social fragmentation. An Australian historian named Geoffrey Blaney, for example, warned that multiculturalism could transform a nation into a, quote, cluster of tribes, a sentiment that found echoes among American conservatives who feared and felt a loss of cohesive national identity. These simmering cultural tensions found a powerful, if not controversial, voice in Patrick J. Buchanan. A conservative commentator and a former White House aide, Buchanan ran for the Republican presidential nomination in 1992. Though unsuccessful in his bid to be president, he delivered a memorable and fiery address at the Republican National Convention that year, explicitly declaring a culture war for the soul of America. Quote, "There is a religious war going on in our country for the soul of America. It is a cultural war, as critical to the kind of nation we will one day be as the Cold War itself." End quote. Buchanan's speech framed American political divisions in starkly moral and cultural terms. He identified issues like abortion, gay rights, feminism, and multiculturalism as the key battlegrounds in the struggle for America's identity. His rhetoric solidified the culture war narrative, a framework that would continue to shape and often polarize American political discourse to this day. The conservative revival of the 1970s and 80s, often encapsulated by the term Reagan Revolution, was more than just a passing political phase. It marked a profound and lasting shift in American politics, society, and economic thought. Its echoes resonate powerfully today, shaping the contours of our contemporary debate. So when we assess the triumph of the right, what did it actually achieve? The new right and Reagan administration could certainly claim significant victories. Economically, they delivered substantial tax cuts, most notably through their Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 and the Tax Reform Act of 1986. They pursued widespread deregulation across numerous industries. The judiciary was shifted in a more conservative direction through key appointments. Inflation, which had ravaged the economy in the 70s, was brought under control. And the economy experienced a significant period of growth in the mid-80s. And in foreign policy, many conservatives pointed to the collapse of the Soviet Union and end of the Cold War as the ultimate validation of Reagan's peace through strength approach. However, the triumph was not absolute, particularly concerning the social agenda of the religious right. Despite their considerable political influence, many of their most cherished goals remained elusive. As the textbook notes, many core social welfare programs established during the New Deal and Great Society, such as Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid largely survived the Reagan years, albeit sometimes with modifications or reduced funding. Landmark Supreme Court decisions like Roe v. Wade, a primary target for social conservatives, it was not overturned during this period. Efforts to legislate certain family values, such as mandatory prayer in public school, faced significant constitutional and popular resistance. Furthermore, as the 1980s drew to a close, many conservative Christians felt that popular culture had become even more vulgar and hostile to their values than they had been a decade before. The national debt, which Reagan had pledged to reduce, had instead ballooned to unprecedented levels due to the combination of tax cuts and increased defense spending. So while the political and economic landscape undoubtedly shifted rightward, deeply entrenched social norms, legal precedents regarding individual liberties, and the complexities of a pluralistic society meant that the conservative social victory was incomplete, leading to ongoing culture wars rather than a settled conservative order. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the conservative revival was a fundamental political realignment in the United States. The Solid South, it was once a bedrock of the Democratic Party, and it continued its decades-long shift to become a Republican stronghold that it is today, a transformation that was accelerated in the 1960s as civil rights movements, but it solidified during the Reagan years. The mobilization of evangelical and fundamentalist Christian groups like the Moral Majority transformed the religious right into a powerful and indispensable pillar of the Republican Party coalition, ensuring that the social and moral issues would remain central to its platform and to the national political debate. The ideological battle sharpened during this era contributed significantly to the increasing political polarization of American society. The clear distinctions drawn by the new right between conservative and liberal values and the often confrontational rhetoric of the culture wars made bipartisan compromise more difficult and contributed to the deeply divided political landscape that we see today. For those of us living today, the conservative revival of the late 20th century was a watershed moment in American history. It didn't just change election outcomes, it fundamentally reshaped the terms of the political debates. And it reshaped the role of the government, the nation's economic trajectory, and its posture on the world stage. The arguments ignited during this era over the size and scope of the government, the meaning of economic fairness, the nature of American foreign policy, and the definition of core cultural values are not relics of a bygone era. They are, in many ways, the very fabric of our political discourse today. The questions raised with such force in the 70s and the 1980s about the balance between individual liberty and collective responsibility, the definition of American identity in an increasingly diverse nation, the pursuit of economic opportunity for all, and America's role in a complex global landscape remain profoundly relevant today. The triumph of the right, as our textbook chapter calls it, was indeed a triumph for a particular set of ideas in a specific political coalition, but its legacy is an ongoing story, an unfinished chapter in the continuing American experience. I'm Dr. G, and I'll see y'all in the past.